Hey guys, tonight we're curling up in a cold straw-stuffed bed in the back corner of a creaky mud-walled cottage where someone's snoring 3 feet away. A pig is rustling under the table, and the concept of personal space hasn't been invented yet. You're trying to imagine sex in the Middle Ages, but spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this mental image. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and what time it is where you're listening just to prove you're still awake. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge across a muddy village square in the year 1253, cold air biting your cheeks. You duck into a low-slung doorway, pulling a wooden plank closed behind you. Welcome to your home, for better or worse. Inside, the single room is lit by a sputtering tallow candle and smells like damp wool, cooked cabbage, and the faint suggestion of goat. You can just make out 4 shapes huddled on a pile of blankets in the corner. That's your family, all of them. Yes, even Uncle Thomas, who has the terrible habit of talking in his sleep and grinding his teeth like he's fighting demons. This is your love nest. Privacy. That's something only God gets to enjoy. The medieval peasant home is what historians politely call multifunctional. It's your kitchen, bedroom, pantry, birthing room, dying room, and sometimes barn. If you're lucky, there's a curtain. If you're really lucky, someone taught the kids not to stare. And yet people still managed to get it on, somehow. Now, there's something you should understand. The average medieval person, especially in Western Europe, lived in a house that was usually 1 room, maybe 2, if they were relatively well off. The walls were made of wattle and daub, basically woven sticks and mud, and insulation was a dream, yet to be dreamed. The hearth in the center of the room gave warmth, cooked food, and filled the house with a lovely, smoky haze that clung to your tunic, your hair, and your nose hairs. At night, families often slept together for warmth, sometimes on shared straw mattresses or sacks filled with leaves. The term bed is generous. These weren't your IKEA specials with memory foam and cute throw pillows. They were musty, itchy, and occasionally hosted a community of bedbugs that had generational property rights. So, how did anyone manage a little romance? Very creatively. There are recorded accounts of couples timing things carefully. Maybe they waited until the kids had passed out from sheer boredom or fatigue. Maybe they went for a walk in the woods and made do among the brambles. One clever trick, bundling, where an unmarried couple might be allowed to sleep in the same bed, fully clothed and often tied into sacks or separated by a wooden board. Not foolproof, and certainly not passion-free. Scientific fact here. The pineal gland, which helps regulate sleep through melatonin, is sensitive to light. Medieval sleep was often divided into first sleep, and second sleep. 2 periods of rest, separated by a stretch of wakefulness. Guess what people did during that midnight intermission? Yep, talked, prayed, stoked the fire, and occasionally did the horizontal liturgical dance. Fringe tidbit. Some households didn't even own separate sleeping areas for adults and children. That's right. Little Timmy might be pretending to be asleep 6 inches away while you're quietly trying to express marital affection under a single itchy blanket. The term scarred for life wasn't invented yet, but the experience probably helped. You tiptoe through your memory of history class and realize something bedrooms, as we know them, didn't really exist. The modern idea of each person, or even each couple, having a private room to themselves. That's a luxury that came much later. In the medieval period, the bedroom wasn't a retreat. It was just one part of life's chaotic stew. A bed was sometimes shared with guests, servants, or even travelers who paid for a spot on the floor. Hospitality could get real intimate. Scientists still argue whether this constant closeness increased family bonding or just made everyone resent each other in low-grade silence. Some suggest it helped create tighter social structures. Others point out that stress levels were probably through the thatched roof, especially when one of the kids brought home fleas. Let's not forget that nobles weren't much better off. Sure, a lord might have a separate chamber, but his servants were often there too, sleeping in corners or on benches. Curtains were more decorative than effective. So, while a noble couple might technically have privacy, they were also rarely alone. And if they weren't in their room, well, the castle walls had ears. Quick reality check. If you were a medieval housewife, your schedule was brutal. You rose with the sun, milked the animals, fetched water, managed the household, made meals, spun wool, maybe helped in the fields, then cleaned, prayed, and finally collapsed into a pile of straw next to your snoring husband. If you were lucky, he hadn't eaten onions. If you were really lucky, the kids were staying at grandma's. Oh, and speaking of straw, the floor of your home was often covered with it. Not for coziness, but to soak up spills bodily or otherwise. The straw was changed out maybe every few weeks. Sometimes they threw in herbs like lavender or mint to mask the smell. This delightful mess was literally known as the rushes. So yeah, you might say medieval intimacy involved natural elements. Still, there were moments. A stolen kiss by candlelight. A lingering glance over a shared bowl of pottage. A mutual agreement that Uncle Thomas should probably take the night shift watching the goats. Even in the most unromantic settings, people found ways to connect. You shift your thoughts now to how many expressions we still use today come from these intimate medieval setups. Hit the hay, sleep tight, and even bed and board, they all have roots in this era. It's comforting in a weird way to realize that despite the differences in technology, culture, and expectations, people back then still wanted the same things: warmth, closeness, and maybe, just maybe, a few minutes of feeling like it was just the two of you in the whole wide world. Of course, the baby crying in the corner, the cow lowing outside, and the wind howling through the poorly sealed walls quickly reminded you otherwise. So no medieval sex wasn't wild in the way HBO might sell it. It was clumsy, time-squeezed, scratchy, and occasionally accompanied by livestock noises. But it was real. Tender, sometimes. Improvised, always. And maybe, just maybe, that made it all the more meaningful. You settle into your hay-stuffed mattress now, eyes drooping, as candlelight flickers across the smoke-darkened beams above. You hear the gentle rustle of someone turning over. Someone whispers a prayer. Outside, an owl calls. You pull the blanket up to your nose. The pig snorts beneath the table. It's not romantic, but it is human. The morning sun hasn't even cracked through the mist yet, but you're already up because the rooster decided 4:37 a.m. was the perfect time to scream directly into your soul. You blink the crust out of your eyes, stretch your aching limbs, and immediately remember you're living in a time when most of your diet is barley and religious guilt. And that guilt, oh, it's about to get personal. The church, in all its glorious authority, didn't just police your Sunday attire or your thoughts about envy. No, it marched straight into your bedroom, or rather your communal sleeping corner, and laid down the rules for exactly how and when you were allowed to make love. And spoiler, it was less do what feels right and more don't do it on Thursdays, or during Lent, or with too much enthusiasm. Welcome to the world of medieval Christian sexual doctrine. It's equal parts fascinating, absurd, and wildly overbearing. At its core, church doctrine taught that sex was only acceptable within marriage and only for the purpose of procreation. Pleasure, that was suspicious. And the idea of enjoying sex too much, that bordered on heresy. You've probably heard the joke about the missionary position being the only acceptable one. Well, that wasn't entirely a joke back then. Church authorities, especially in the early Middle Ages, explicitly dictated that positions deviating from man on top, woman underneath were considered unnatural or even sinful. Variations weren't just frowned upon, they were sometimes linked to demonic influence. Scientific fact: in the 13th century, theologian Thomas Aquinas classified sexual sins by severity. At the very top of the naughty list were acts that perverted the natural order, including oral sex, anal sex, homosexuality, masturbation, and yes, even sex in weird positions. Missionary was the golden standard. Anything else meant you were probably halfway to hell, or at least on a short list. But it gets even more delightfully micromanaged. The church produced penitentials books that served as spiritual tax codes of sin. These listed every conceivable moral failing, along with how many days of penance each required. You know, in case you needed to do the math. A real-life example from one of these penitentials: if you had sex on a feast day, that could earn you up to 7 years of penance. 7. For context, that's longer than most medieval marriages lasted. Another fun rule: no sex during Lent, or Advent, or the 40 days after giving birth, or the night before taking communion, or on Sundays, or Wednesdays, or Fridays. That left you with Mondays, possibly. Scientists still argue whether this intense regulation of sexuality helped enforce social stability or just made people sneakier. Some scholars suggest it was about power controlling bodies as an extension of controlling souls. Others see it as a mix of spiritual discipline and just plain paranoia. But let's not forget, this was all aimed at married couples. If you weren't married and got caught having sex, the consequences could be severe. Depending on your location and century, you might be fined, publicly shamed, whipped, or even excommunicated. And yet, people still did it. A lot. Records from village courts are littered with cases of fornication, adultery, and what we'd now call public indecency. Humans gonna human. Now, picture this. You're a pious medieval man, newlywed, trying to follow the rules. You consult your local priest, maybe even leaf through a borrowed penitential and realize your window for righteous bedroom time is basically 2 Thursdays in October. The rest of the year is a minefield of moral no-nos. And heaven forbid your wife seems to enjoy herself. That might mean she's possessed, or worse French. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some clergy believed that a woman experiencing orgasm was essential for conception. Yes, really. This bizarre intersection of pseudoscience and theology meant that technically the church wanted you to try to get her there, but also not enjoy it. Confused yet, so were they. Meanwhile, in monasteries and convents, the conversation took a different turn. Many monastics were expected to remain celibate, not just in action, but in thought. Theologians wrote long, agonized tracts about dreams, temptation, and how demons might use lust as a weapon against the devout. A monk having an erotic dream might wake up convinced he was spiritually compromised. Imagine that confession. "Forgive me, Father, for I dreamed of Margaret from the bakery again." You sit back in your mental haystack, reflecting on how tangled the lines between morality biology and social order were. The church wasn't simply wagging fingers. It shaped how entire generations thought about desire, not as something human, but as something dangerous. Women in particular were viewed with deep suspicion. Medieval theologians inherited a long tradition of blaming women for the fall, and therefore saw female sexuality as either sinful or saintly, nothing in between. You recall the image of Eve being tempted by the serpent. That story wasn't just religious lore, it was practically medical advice in medieval Europe. Many believed that women were naturally more lustful, more emotionally unstable, and more likely to seduce men into sin. So, of course, it made sense to regulate when, how, and even why you'd sleep with your wife. But despite all the prohibitions, sex was still a normal part of life. Most people married young, and many families had multiple children. There was simply too much going on in the real world. Plowing fields, fighting off plagues, scraping together dinner for people to live as monks. And so many did what humans do best. They bent the rules, interpreted them flexibly, or just ignored them when the priest wasn't looking. Imagine sneaking glances at your spouse across a shared meal, knowing that tonight might be one of those precious legal nights. You exchange whispers in the dark, listen for sleeping breaths nearby, and try to be quiet. Even in the most pious homes, the heart had its say. Interestingly, there were also church-sponsored marriage guides, basically medieval premarital counseling. These emphasized mutual respect, affection, and even warned against treating your spouse like an object. It wasn't all repression and judgment. Some clergy genuinely wanted to help people have loving, balanced relationships as long as they kept it within the holy framework, of course. And let's be honest, some of the clergy weren't exactly models of celibacy. Scandals involving monks, nuns, and even popes were not uncommon. One pope reportedly had a child with his own niece. Others were accused of keeping mistresses or visiting brothels. So, while the church preached purity, human nature kept kicking down the back door. You begin to understand now why people walked such a fine line between faith and flesh. Their spiritual world was all-encompassing, and their bodies were viewed as both gifts and potential traps. It was complicated, messy, and often contradictory, just like real life. The candles burning low again in your mind's cottage. You feel the scratch of linen sheets, hear the wind outside, and imagine someone softly whispering a prayer of forgiveness for last night's brief moment of joy. Or maybe they're just whispering, "Not tonight, my back hurts." Either way, the rules have been followed more or less. You breathe out slowly, not judging, just observing. Because here's the truth: for all the dogma, people in the Middle Ages were still people. They felt desire. They found ways to be close. They laughed. They whispered. They hoped for moments when love felt stronger than fear. And sometimes they just really wanted to ignore the rules and have a little fun on a Tuesday. It's a breezy April evening, somewhere around the year 1178, and you're standing outside a small chapel, gazing up at a sky that's just a little too perfect. Blue-wide, filled with birds that sound suspiciously joyful. But here's the catch: you've just remembered that it's Easter season, and according to the church, you are officially barred from any bedroom activity that involves even a hint of fun. Yes, welcome to one of the lesser-known side effects of the liturgical calendar, seasonal celibacy. If you've ever wondered whether the church literally bans sex based on the time of year, the answer is, oh, absolutely. If you were trying to maintain both your spiritual and romantic life in medieval Europe, you had to navigate a maze of religious holidays, feast days, fast days, and just plain do not days. Let's lay it out. Lent, 40 days of penance before Easter. Advent, another period of preparation and restraint before Christmas. Then there were saints' days, Wednesdays, Fridays because of the crucifixion, Saturdays in honor of the Virgin Mary, and Sundays because, of course, the Sabbath. If you're counting, that left you with maybe 1 or 2 safe days a week, and that's assuming there wasn't a local feast day thrown in, which there usually was. Scientists still argue whether medieval people actually followed these restrictions or if most folks just nodded solemnly in church and then went about their normal lives. But what we do know is that church teachings explicitly discouraged sex during holy seasons, and they weren't shy about saying so. Some texts claimed that a child conceived during Lent would be born weak, disfigured, or spiritually compromised. Others warned that demons were more likely to possess you if you indulged in fleshly pleasure during sacred times. Now that's a bedtime story you won't find in your kid's illustrated Bible. You picture a husband and wife whispering by candlelight after a long day in the fields. The wind is howling outside, the kids are asleep, and the fire is finally just low enough to be cozy. One of them reaches out. The other gently pulls back and whispers, "It's Maundy Thursday," and just like that, the mood is gone. A real historical example. Some church authorities argued that sex was forbidden not only during Lent and Advent, but also during the 40 days after childbirth to purify the mother, and even before taking communion. This led to something almost comical. Devout couples keeping complex calendars to track when they could and couldn't have sex, like a kind of spiritual fertility app, except made of parchment and fear. Here's your scientific fact. Melatonin, the hormone that helps regulate circadian rhythms, is affected by light levels, just like back in Section 1. Medieval, people slept in shorter bursts, often waking up around midnight. This gave them time to pray stoke the fire. Or, well, consider breaking a church-imposed dry spell. But during Lent, that midnight window was expected to be filled with contemplation and repentance, not cuddling. Now, let's not forget the weird weather factor. Some local beliefs held that engaging in sex during a thunderstorm or certain lunar phases could lead to monstrous births or divine punishment. Lightning was seen as an expression of divine anger, and while that's not exactly the mood-setting background noise you hope for. Fringe tidbit. In some rural traditions, people believe that conceiving during the dog days of summer, roughly late July to early August, could result in sickly or deformed children due to the bad humors floating in the air. So yes, there was literally a time when weather forecasts impacted people's decisions to get intimate. Now, imagine being newly married. You're young, maybe 16 or 17, and have waited months for the wedding. Finally, you get to share a bed with the love of your life. But oops, your wedding lands during Lent. That's 40 days of awkward eyes locked sleeping and constant temptation. The phrase burning with passion feels all too real, especially with the local priest reminding you that giving in might condemn your souls. So what did people do with all that pent-up energy? Well, they worked. Hard. Literally and metaphorically. Busy sun, hands, quiet thoughts. The medieval work schedule didn't leave much time for brooding anyway. From dawn to dusk, people were planting, harvesting, cooking, brewing, stitching, building, or caring for livestock. Physical exhaustion has always been history's best birth control. Still, the tension was there, pressing quietly, whispering at the edge of your brain during Vespers. Maybe you'd sneak a look. Maybe there was a lingering touch. Maybe you both just happened to fall asleep a little too close that night, and maybe your hand accidentally found its way under the blanket. Cue the guilt, and the confession, and the penance. And let's talk penance. The church loved a good spiritual math problem. For sex during Lent, you might be assigned weeks or even months of prayer, fasting, or manual labor. Some especially dramatic authorities said that if you died unrepentant after breaking sexual taboos, you could be denied a Christian burial. That meant no proper grave, no funeral rites, and no entrance into heaven because of one poorly timed romp. Yet even in this tightly regulated system, human nature kept nudging its way back in. Folk traditions and local customs often softened the harshness of church rules. For example, some communities celebrated fertility festivals right before Lent, as if to squeeze in one last celebration of life before the long fast. These festivals were colorful, chaotic, and yes, sometimes included extracurricular activities. You picture a rustic spring festival with garlands dancing a bit too much mead and couples slipping off into the woods. All perfectly timed just before Lent locked everything down like a medieval chastity alarm. Of course, not everyone bought into the fear. There were rebels, quiet and loud. Some couples simply ignored the rules. Others questioned them. And a few brave or reckless souls even spoke out. There are records of local preachers getting in trouble for suggesting that the church's obsession with controlling sex was well a little overboard. One scholar from the 14th century even argued that a married couple had a duty to to keep each other happy in the bedroom, regardless of the calendar. That opinion didn't go over well with the bishops, but it shows how even then people were thinking critically about love, desire, and where the line between faith and joy should really fall. You lie back now, imagining a flickering candle on a stone windowsill. Outside, rain is tapping gently on the roof. Inside, two people lie together, breathing quietly in the dark. Maybe they hold hands. Maybe they just listen to the wind. Maybe they disobey just a little and find in that moment a small rebellion wrapped in tenderness. The seasons turn, the rules shift, but the human heart, that stays the same. The fire crackles softly in the stone hearth. You sit on a heavy bench in a grand hall, draped with tapestries, nursing a wooden goblet of spiced wine. All around you, candlelight dances across armor velvet and smug smiles. Welcome to the court of a high medieval noble, where everyone is pretending to be perfectly proper, and yet somehow everyone also seems to be seducing everyone else. Quietly, strategically, with intense eye contact and a suspicious number of songs about longing. Because if you thought peasants had to navigate a complex dance of religious restriction and logistical nightmares, wait until you see how the nobility handled sex, love, and everything in between. Spoiler, it's messy. Really messy. In this world, marriage is rarely about love. It's about land titles, alliances, and heir production. You, as a noble, might be married off at 13 to someone you've never met, whose chief qualification is owning 3 sheep fields and a distant claim to your father's cousin's wine cellar. Romance. That's something for after the paperwork is signed, and often not with your spouse. Enter courtly love. This is where things get spicy, but also absurd. Courtly love was a kind of performative romance, ritualized longing between a nobleman and a lady, often one who was very much not his wife. You'd write, her poems wear her colors into battle, sigh deeply while staring out of windows, and maybe if the stars aligned and her husband wasn't paying attention, sneak into her tower for an actual tryst. Scientists still argue whether courtly love was mostly literary fantasy or reflected actual behavior. Some say it was metaphorical, an idealized expression of chivalry and devotion. Others believe it was the noble version of flirt and chill, officially poetic, unofficially horny. A real historical anecdote, the troubadour, Guillaume Nans of Aquitaine, one of the earliest poets of courtly love, wrote verses about sneaking into nunneries, chasing married women, and generally making scandal look like a lifestyle. He also had political power, which conveniently made his affairs harder to punish. And the ladies weren't passive in this game. Many noble women played the part of the adored muse with flair. They encouraged suitors, exchanged secret notes, and even composed poetry of their own. Think of it as emotional fencing. Sharp, elegant, and layered with innuendo. One line too forward and you risked dishonor. Too subtle, and your beloved might just end up falling for your cousin instead. Here's your scientific fact for this section. The limbic system, especially the amygdala, is closely involved in emotional memory. This helps explain why forbidden or secret relationships often feel more intense. Sneaking around a castle, whispering under cloaks, dodging watchful servants. That's adrenaline mixed with dopamine. Medieval love might have been slow burning, but it was biochemically gripping. Now add political intrigue. Many affairs weren't just romantic, they were tactical. Seducing the right person could gain you influence at court, a better marriage for your child, or even protection from enemies. Sleeping with the wrong person, though, that could get you imprisoned, exiled, or very, very dead. Let's take Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen of both France and England, one of the most powerful women of the 12th century. She was famed for her intelligence charm and allegedly several romantic liaisons. Was it all true, maybe? Maybe not. But the rumors alone were enough to shape her legacy. In a world where power and desire were tightly woven, gossip was its own currency. Now, let's talk bedrooms, or chambers as they were known. Noble homes had more space than peasant huts, but privacy was still relative. A lord might share his room with a valet, a secretary, and even a small dog or two. Heavy curtains helped a little, but if you were planning a clandestine encounter, timing was everything. Many nobles arranged secret meetings in gardens, chapels, or hunting lodges. There's something inherently poetic and ridiculous about sneaking off into the woods in full brocade just to whisper sweet nothings. Fringe tidbit: some nobles kept love tokens from their partners, locks of hair, bits of cloth, even chewed pieces of bread. One 14th century knight supposedly wore his lover's bloody bandage into battle for luck. Romance, medieval style, slightly unhinged, deeply unsanitary. Of course, adultery among the nobility was both common and dangerous. If discovered, the consequences could be brutal. A noblewoman accused of infidelity risked being locked in a tower, exiled, or worse. Men usually got off lighter. Shocking, I know, but even they weren't immune to scandal. A well-placed rumor could ruin a political career faster than you can say, she's not your cousin, she's your half-sister. Despite all this, love bloomed. Real, aching, inconvenient love. There are recorded cases of knights dying in battle, with poems to their mistresses sewn into their tunics, of ladies refusing to remarry after a forbidden lover died, and of couples so scandalously devoted they ended up in exile together, cold, but very much in love. One famous story, Abelard and Heloise. He was a philosopher, she a brilliant student. Their affair led to pregnancy, secret marriage, and eventual disaster, including him being forcibly castrated by her furious uncle. They spent the rest of their lives in separate religious orders, writing each other letters so passionate and philosophical that they're still studied today. Forbidden, yes, tragic certainly, but also undeniably heartbreakingly human. You lean back now, imagining the heavy stone walls of a castle bedroom, the chill of the air, the quiet creak of footsteps outside the door. Two people, cloaked in fur and fear, share a moment. Maybe it's a kiss. Maybe it's just a glance. But in that instant, they forget duty. They forget politics. They remember that they're alive and that they're not alone. The noble class, for all its elegance, lived in a constant tug of war between responsibility and desire. Marry for wealth, love in secret, bear heirs, bury feelings, or don't, and suffer the scandal. Either way, someone's whispering down a candle-lit hallway, heart-pounding breath held hoping the servant outside isn't listening. Because in this world, sex is never just sex. It's power, it's politics, it's poetry and peril, all bundled into one tension-laced glance across a feast table. And if you're lucky, or perhaps unlucky enough, you might just find yourself caught up in the middle of it. The sun's low over the fields, now casting a warm golden wash over the patchy rooftops of a thatched village. Smoke curls from chimneys, and the air smells like onions, sheep, and ambition. You're not in a castle tonight. No velvet, no courtly poetry, no political scandal, just dirt under your nails and a little hope in your heart. Welcome to the world of medieval peasant romance. Less Romeo and Juliet, more sheep pen and haystack. You lean on a wooden fence, watching as the last of the pigs snuffle their way back into the yard. Across the path, someone catches your eye. She's carrying a basket of turnips. You're holding a rake. The moment is profoundly agricultural. But there's a sparkle in her eye and a little smirk on her face. And for a second, the smell of manure doesn't even matter. Because even among the lower classes, where life was hard labor, was endless, and privacy was a myth, people still fell in love, or at least into bed, or hay. Or sometimes behind the church, if you were bold and didn't mind a ghost or two. Peasant passion didn't come with poems or embroidered kerchiefs. It came with shared chores, flirtation over bread ovens, and secret trysts stolen between tasks. You might pass a note, or more likely, a carved token, or simply whisper something scandalous as you carried water from the village well. Here's your scientific fact. Oxytocin, sometimes called the love hormone, plays a big role in bonding and trust. And surprise, shared physical labor, especially repetitive tasks done in sync, like farming or food prep, actually increases oxytocin release. So when you and your crush are rhythmically pounding barley side by side, you're basically hardwired to feel emotionally connected. Awkward, but biologically efficient. Still expressing attraction wasn't simple. Peasants were often subject to strict community expectations. Courting could be monitored by family neighbors, even the local priest. And don't think you could hide a sudden romance gossip in a medieval village traveled faster than fleas at a mutton feast. You may have heard of bundling in the peasant context. Yep, it happened here too. Unmarried couples might be allowed to sleep together, fully clothed to talk, and get to know each other in a supervised setting. Some regions even had literal bundling boards separating the pair in bed. Other places, not so strict. And that, of course, is where babies tended to make their mysterious early appearances. Fringe tidbit. In some medieval villages, there were designated gathering spaces like festivals, maypole dances, and seasonal markets where flirting was expected. These events gave young people a rare moment to mingle freely. Songs were sung, drinks were drunk, and yes, under the stars, hay got flattened. But things could escalate fast. Premarital sex, while common, wasn't exactly celebrated. If a woman became pregnant before marriage, she might be shamed, fined, or pressured into a rushed wedding. In some areas, the man would be forced to marry her or pay for the child's upkeep. But in others, she was on her own. Scientists still argue whether medieval communities truly embraced a more casual attitude toward premarital intimacy, or whether the records we have only capture the moments when it went wrong. Some historians suggest that sexual activity among peasants was pragmatically tolerated, especially if it led to marriage. Others argue that public morality was more rigid than we think. Now imagine this. You're a thatcher's apprentice, 19 years old, heart in your throat as you slip behind the granary after dusk. She's already there, waiting with a grin and a rough spun cloak. You lean in close. There are no violins, just the sound of frogs croaking, a pig snorting in the distance, and the itchy reality of straw poking through your tunic. It's not glamorous, but it's yours. And intimacy wasn't always secret. Once married peasant couples might enjoy surprisingly warm and affectionate partnerships. Many slept huddled close on straw beds, wrapped in wool blankets, whispering to each other long after the candles went out. They labored together, shared burdens, laughed in the face of sickness and debt. Love, real love, often grew slowly but stubbornly, like the roots of an old cabbage. Let's also talk about the parental role in all this. Marriages among peasants were generally arranged, but not as strictly as in the noble classes. Parents often had a say, especially when property or livestock were involved, but young people's feelings sometimes mattered too. If your father liked the girl, and her dowry came with a goat, your wedding might be fast-tracked. Bonus points if she had good teeth. Sex education, though, not exactly a classroom affair. Most knowledge came from observation older siblings, or increasingly vague warnings like, keep your apron tight or don't let him near the cider shed. Still, there were rules, even laws. Many regions used something called bans, a public announcement of an upcoming marriage made 3 times to the local community. This gave people time to object, maybe because of prior relationships, close kinship, or good old-fashioned village drama. And of course, there were always those who didn't wait. Records show plenty of cases where couples were fined or publicly punished for sleeping together before the wedding was finalized. Public penance could involve standing barefoot outside the church, or even being paraded through the village holding a symbolic object of your shame. Think Walk of Embarrassment 14th Century Edition. But not all punishment was harsh. Some communities found humorous ways to respond. One medieval prank involved placing a yoke around the necks of an unwed couple caught canoodling and parading them through town like oxen. It was humiliating, sure, but not life-ruining. In a way, it was society's oddball way of saying, we see you, we disapprove, but also, we know you're human. Quirky right now. Pull back for a moment. It's nighttime. You're curled under a shared blanket, body aching from the day's work, breath visible in the chill. Beside you, someone stirs your partner, your co-laborer, your person. You don't have much, but you have warmth. You have rhythm. You have moments like this. Peasant passion wasn't poetic. It was earthy, scrappy, honest. It was late-night laughter, soft sighs muffled by sheep wool, a stolen touch under the table when no one was looking, and the understanding that tomorrow would come hard and fast. But tonight, For a brief moment, the world belonged to just the two of you, and maybe a goat. You're hunched over a wooden basin now, splashing icy water on your face from a cracked ceramic jug. The sun's barely up, and already your back aches, your knees creak, and your hands are raw from yesterday's labor. But what really bothers you, what always bothers you, is the smell. Yours, the house's, the world's. Because here's the deal, hygiene in the Middle Ages was not great. And when it comes to sex intimacy, or even just laying down next to another human being, that fact takes on a whole new, nose-wrinkling dimension. Let's rip off the linen bandage. People did bathe in the Middle Ages, just not often, not thoroughly, and certainly not with lush bath bombs or eucalyptus-scented shampoo. You, dear listener, are lucky if you get one full-body rinse every week or two. That's assuming your village hasn't been hit with a water shortage, a religious ban on public baths, or you know the plague. Now imagine engaging in some late-night medieval intimacy. There's no deodorant, no toothbrushes, no clean sheets. You're both wrapped in wool and smelling like a stew of sweat, smoke-salted meat, and whatever livestock you brushed up against that day. Romantic. Maybe not. But in the Middle Ages, that was normal. Everyone smelled so, no one really noticed until they got close. Really close. Scientific fact. Human noses can become desensitized to persistent smells. Something called olfactory fatigue. So while you might not notice your own funk, after a long day of digging ditches, your partner definitely will when they roll over and inhale a full face of medieval musk. And yet, despite the sweat and soot, people still longed for closeness. Touch, skin, even if it meant getting familiar with someone else's armpit forest. Speaking of which body hair, it was everywhere. Shaving wasn't routine, and waxing wasn't a thing. Both men and women generally let things grow freely. Medieval beauty standards were a little more flexible than ours. Pale skin was considered attractive, sure, but beyond that, if you were clean enough and didn't have visible boils, you were a catch. Still, grooming did exist. People combed their hair regularly, not just to look presentable, but to remove lice, which were as common as bread. There were even special lice combs passed down through families. Sweet right here, darling, have grandma's nitpicker. It's an heirloom. Bathing when it happened was often a social or sensual event. Public bathhouses were common in cities across medieval Europe until the later Middle Ages. These bathhouses weren't just about cleanliness, they were also social spaces. You'd chat-eat sometimes, even listen to music, while naked. In fact, some bathhouses gained reputations as places where more than just dirt got rinsed off. Not all were brothels, but let's just say the line between relaxing soak and scandalous romp got a little steamy. Fringe tidbit. In medieval Japan and parts of the Islamic world, bathing was far more regular and ritualized. Europeans, especially by the later Middle Ages, were seen by some travelers as weirdly grimy. Cultural hygiene standards varied wildly, proving once again that clean is relative. But even in Europe, the idea that bathing led to illness started to spread in the 14th century. Doctors, confused by germ theory, which didn't exist yet, believed open pores from hot water could let bad air in causing sickness. So, ironically, at the exact moment, people probably needed to wash more during plague outbreaks, they started washing less. Scientists still argue whether this drop in hygiene was caused more by health fears or religious conservatism. Some blame the church for associating nudity with sin, leading to the shutdown of many bathhouses. Others think it was just practical fear. Don't undress or you'll catch death. Either way, it didn't help anyone's love life. Now picture this. You've just come home from a long day tending pigs. Your partner's been mending clothes in a smoky room for hours. You both smell like effort. You both itch. But the stars are out, the hearth is low, and something stirs. Maybe it's affection. Maybe it's instinct. Either way, you reach out. And in that moment, none of it matters. Not the smell, not the grime, not the fact that there's straw poking you in the thigh. Because desire at its core is stubborn. It thrives in the least convenient conditions. And in the Middle Ages, that was basically all conditions. Let's wander back to noble households for a moment. Hygiene, there was only slightly better. Nobles might have access to warm baths, scented oils, and servants to bring them fresh linens. But again, fresh is a generous word. Laundry was done irregularly, and even wealthy people might wear the same undergarments for days. Instead of brushing their teeth, they might chew parsley rinse with vinegar, or rub their gums with cloth. Sexy, no. But it beats medieval morning breath. Perfumes and herbs helped mask unpleasant odors. Lavender, rosemary, and rosewater were common and sometimes dumped directly into bath water. Some even wore pouches of fragrant herbs around their necks or stuffed them into their clothes. Think of it like a medieval Febreze pouch dangling between your ribs. And if you're wondering about birth control, well, good luck. Most methods were herbal and wildly unreliable. Some involved drinking concoctions of pennyroyal or inserting pessaries made of wool soaked in wine honey or other substances you definitely don't want in your business. This wasn't so much science as desperate guesswork. And again, cleanliness. Not high on the list of concerns. Still, passion found a way. You imagine a couple in a quiet cottage bathing each other with ragged cloths and warm water heated over the fire. Maybe they take turns. Maybe they laugh. Maybe someone slips on the wet floor. It's not a spa, but it's an act of care, of intimacy, of saying, I want you to feel good even here, even now. And the truth is, being clean or cleaner was sometimes part of seduction. In some texts, women are described combing their hair before bed or dabbing their wrists with oils. Men might wash their hands, wipe down their faces, or even gasp, change their tunics. Tiny efforts, but meaningful. Signals of intention. Because while the standards were low, the feelings weren't. There's a tenderness in scraping grime from your partner's back, in plucking lice from their scalp, in cleaning their fingernails before lying together in the dark. These were acts of love in a world that didn't offer many luxuries. So tonight, as the fire fades and the candle flickers, you lie still beneath your wool blanket, surrounded by the scent of smoked soil and skin. You've washed as best you can. You've combed your hair. You've picked the cleanest hay you could find. And someone's waiting beside you. It's not perfect, but it's enough. You're crouched near the village boundary, watching the mist curl around the trees like fingers. The woods feel different tonight. Quieter, heavier. Maybe it's the wind. Maybe it's the way your neighbor warned you not to wander during a waning moon. Or maybe it's that old rumor. the one about the girl who kissed the blacksmith's apprentice and woke up speaking in tongues. Because in the medieval mind, lust wasn't just a personal indulgence. It was a spiritual vulnerability. A door cracked open, and if you weren't careful, something might crawl through it. Welcome to the dark underbelly of medieval sexuality, where desire could be blamed not on hormones or biology, but on witchcraft demons and the literal devil himself. You sit by the hearth with your cloak drawn tight, listening as the village matron tells stories of incubus demons, dark spirits said to visit sleeping women in the night, pinning them down and stealing their breath in exchange for something else. These demons were taken seriously. There were actual reports, court records even, of women claiming to be visited by a shadowy figure, often described as cold-heavy and impossible to fight off. Scientific fact. Today, we recognize many of these experiences as episodes of sleep paralysis, a neurological condition in which a person wakes up unable to move, often hallucinating a presence nearby. But in the Middle Ages, lacking brain scans and serotonin receptors, people filled in the blanks with theology. Enter the incubus and his female counterpart, the succubus demons who sexually assaulted humans in their sleep. Monks were particularly susceptible, it seemed, and many wrote tortured confessions of waking up drenched in shame, certain they'd been violated by something infernal. Scientists still argue whether these accounts reflected actual belief or were convenient explanations for, let's say, nocturnal emissions. But the fear was real. If lust could be demonic, then a single impure thought could mark the beginning of spiritual decay. Every temptation became a test, and every failure a crack the devil could slip through. And the church didn't help ease these fears. In fact, some theologians claimed that the devil used lust to drag the righteous into sin. One medieval bishop even wrote that Satan's primary method of corrupting holy people was through dreams of naked women, often conveniently modeled on someone they knew. You might be wondering, did people really believe that sex and witchcraft were connected? Absolutely. In fact, it became central to many witch trials. Women accused of witchcraft were often interrogated about their supposed sexual congress with demons or the devil himself. This wasn't just about sin. It was about spiritual treason, the idea that a woman could willingly give herself to Satan in exchange for knowledge power or carnal pleasure. That's right, medieval authorities were less concerned with broomsticks and more obsessed with bedroom secrets. Fringe. Tidbit: one of the more disturbing beliefs was that demons could collect sperm from men during sleep, store it, and later use it to impregnate women. That's how people explained pregnancies with no known father. It's biology, but through the lens of fear and folklore, and a total lack of understanding about reproductive science. Now, imagine you're a young woman living on the edge of the forest alone since your husband died last winter. You help neighbors with healing herbs, tend goats, and keep mostly to yourself. One day, someone's crops fail. A child falls ill. People start whispering. And because someone's teenage son woke up one morning confused and embarrassed, you become the explanation. The connection between lust and the supernatural wasn't just metaphorical. It became a way to control, to scapegoat, and to punish. Women who were seen as too confident, too beautiful, too strange, or too unashamed were often the first to be accused of witchcraft, and their sins were frequently described in sexual terms. Let's look at the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches, a 15th century manual on identifying and prosecuting witches. It went into great grotesque detail about how witches supposedly used sex to corrupt and destroy. One claim that witches could steal a man's genitals through magic, rendering him impotent unless he begged for mercy. These weren't fringe beliefs, they were widely taught. And they left their mark. Even ordinary love could be tinged with suspicion. If a woman seemed to hold too much sway over her husband, especially if he abandoned reason, wealth, or faith in favor of her people, whispered, maybe she used a love potion. Maybe she cast a spell. Maybe she wasn't just charming. Maybe she was dangerous. But the truth was far simpler. Desire is powerful, and power always makes people nervous. Still, people kept falling for each other. They held hands behind market stalls. They kissed by moonlight. They whispered in corners of candlelit churches. And they did it all knowing that passion came with risk, not just of pregnancy or punishment, but of eternal damnation if certain sermons were to be believed. You stir now, picturing a couple wrapped in blankets in a crumbling cottage. One leans over and murmurs something soft, their breath warm on the other's neck. For a moment, there's peace. Then the dog barks, startled. Was it a sound outside? A footstep? A spirit? No. Just the wind? Probably. But they pull the blanket tighter anyway, just in case. And not all stories were grim. Some folktales twisted the fear into humor. There were bawdy ballads about monks seduced by clever witches, only to wake up with sheep instead of women. Jokes about potions that made people fall in love with turnips. Stories where the devil tried to seduce someone but got outwitted by their granny. The line between terror and comedy was always thin, and medieval people were surprisingly good at dancing on it. Still, at the core of all this demonic anxiety was a simple truth. People didn't understand how bodies worked. They didn't know about hormones, neural pathways, or trauma. So when someone felt intense desire, they didn't see it as normal. They saw it as suspicious, possibly supernatural. So you lie back now, eyes flickering with firelight, and wonder what did it feel like back then to love someone so much that the world thought it had to be magic. What did it cost to care in a time when caring could be your undoing? The wind howls again. The candle sputters. But tonight, you're safe. The demons are just old stories. The witches have long since been forgiven. And what's left is the real magic. Two hands reaching for each other in the dark. Not because of a spell, but because of something far more powerful. Choice. The iron is cold when you touch it. Not the cold of the morning air, but a deeper chill, like the kind that lives in the bottom of a well. You're staring at it now, thick, rigid, oddly shaped. Hinges straps a heavy lock. It looks more like a medieval torture device than anything you'd associate with romance. And yet, here it is, clanking ominously in the dusty corner of your mind's museum, the infamous chastity belt. You've heard of it. Everyone has. The idea is burned into popular imagination. A jealous husband off to the Crusades locking up his wife's nether regions in a metal contraption to preserve her virtue. He gallops off into the Holy Land key around his neck, trusting that neither locksmith nor temptation will defeat his ingenuity. But the truth? Well, it's murkier than a moat at midnight. Let's begin with a reality check. Most chastity belts were not real, at least not in the way we think of them. The image of rows of women clanking around in iron underwear is largely a Victorian fantasy, 1 part sexual paranoia, 2 parts historical misunderstanding, and just a dash of fetishistic flair. Scientists still argue whether chastity belts existed in the Middle Ages at all. Some claim that a few belts might have been used perhaps ceremonially or symbolically, but not as widespread tools of control. Others suggest that the metal devices displayed in museums were likely Renaissance or even 19th century inventions created to illustrate how backward or barbaric earlier centuries were. Ironically, that same narrative became its own sort of punishment. But let's not toss the entire belt in the fire just yet. There were attempts to restrict women's sexuality intellectually, religiously, and physically. The belt, real or not, became a potent symbol of those efforts. It represented a culture deeply anxious about female desire, control, and property. Because yes, back then, a woman's body was often seen as her husband's literal asset. Keeping it safe meant keeping it his. Fringe tidbit: in some legal documents, a woman's chastity was equated with a form of dowry or value, like a cow, a field, or a finely woven cloak. Virginity had economic weight. Lose it, and you might lose your marriage prospects, your reputation, or your family's standing. So while the belt itself might not have been widespread, the concept it symbolized absolutely was. You shift in your seat the idea of strapping metal around one's most sensitive areas, already feeling absurd. But consider the logistics. These devices, as often imagined, made of iron padlocked shut, would have been wildly impractical. Hygiene alone would have been a nightmare. Walking, sitting, using the latrine, nearly impossible, and infections almost guaranteed. Here's your scientific fact. The vaginal microbiome is a delicately balanced ecosystem. Introducing metal, especially unclean metal, into that environment for hours or days at a time would almost certainly lead to irritation, bacterial imbalance, and serious infection. And in a world without antibiotics, not a great plan. Some surviving examples of chastity belts are now believed to be hoaxes, artistic interpretations, or misunderstood medical tools. One even had features resembling a back brace more than an undergarment. Others were likely created for curiosity cabinets or as visual warnings. Look how far we've come. Aren't you glad you're not a medieval woman? And yet, the myth persisted. By the Victorian era, chastity belts were being reimagined as tools to prevent self-abuse, a delicate euphemism for masturbation. In this context, the belt wasn't about marital fidelity, but about moral panic. Parents and doctors became obsessed with controlling adolescent urges, especially among girls. Enter the leather-strapped lock-and-key devices marketed as medical aids. So yes, chastity belts became real, but in a way more twisted than even the original myth. Back in the Middle Ages, if a woman was left alone while her husband traveled or went off to war, her fidelity was generally maintained through social surveillance rather than hardware. Neighbors, family, and church leaders all kept watch. If rumors of unfaithfulness spread, consequences ranged from fines to public shaming or worse. Let's paint the picture. You're a merchant's wife in a bustling port town. Your husband is away for 6 months. You're managing the house, the accounts, the servants. Every time you go to market or speak with a customer too long, someone is watching, smiling, judging, whispering. You don't need a metal belt. You've got an entire society trained to lock your legs with glances alone. Still, some women pushed back. There are rare but real records of wives who engaged in affairs while their husbands were away, and even a few who took over the family business gained financial independence or chose not to remarry after being widowed. They weren't common, but they existed, and they remind us that agency, even in a restrictive society, can slip through the cracks. Now imagine a young woman unmarried but curious living in a town filled with trade and travelers. She hears stories, catches glimpses of desire, feels it stir in herself. But the warnings are endless. Lose your virtue. Lose your worth. It's not about love. It's about control. The belt, whether literal, symbolic, or social, is always hovering. And yet somehow, people still found freedom. Behind curtained beds, in meadows at dusk. During harvest festivals, when the ale flowed freely and the rules loosened with the laces. Sometimes the belt came off metaphorically, and someone got a little reckless. Fringe belief. Some folktales claimed that magical keys could open a chastity belt, but only for a true lover. It's part myth, part metaphor, and surprisingly romantic in a slightly metal-clad way. You lie back now, staring at the imagined ceiling of your thatched roof, the iron device long since gone from view. You think about what it means to restrain something that's natural, to control something by fear. You wonder whether the idea of the chastity belt was ever really about virtue, or just about keeping people scared. Because in the end, the strongest lock isn't iron or steel. It's the belief that your body doesn't belong to you, but it does. And even in a world that told people otherwise, through sermons, superstitions, and yes, ridiculous belts, people still reached out for each other, still kissed, still wanted, still found ways to feel alive. So the chastity belt remains not as a widespread artifact, but as a symbol of anxiety, of oppression, of a history shaped by fear and fantasy in equal measure, and also, perhaps as a reminder, when someone tries to control your desire, they're often just terrified of their own. The candlelight flickers as you unroll a thick piece of parchment, the edges curling like it's reluctant to reveal its secrets. You squint at the cramped handwriting and wait. Is that a diagram? You lean in. Yep, it's exactly what you think it is, a crudely drawn image of a man and a woman, doing what only a truly committed scribe would dare illustrate in ink. Welcome to the strange, squirmy, and often hilariously inaccurate world of medieval sex manuals and science. Let's get something straight, medieval Europe wasn't entirely clueless about the human body. But their understanding of sex, reproduction, and anatomy was shaped by a stew of ancient Greek theory, religious doctrine, superstition, and just a sprinkle of straight-up guesswork. It was science, with a really bad map. Start with the classics. Much of medieval medicine came from Galen, a Roman physician who lived centuries earlier. He believed that the human body was governed by four humors: blood phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that good health came from balancing them. Sex. That was seen as a way to release excess heat and moisture. For men, it was healthy. For women, it was complicated. Here's your scientific fact. Galenic theory taught that women had a womb that wandered around the body when deprived of sex or childbirth. Yes, really. The wandering womb was believed to cause everything from hysteria to fainting spells. Solution marriage. Or, in some texts, a strong-smelling substance shoved up the nose, or other places. Medieval aromatherapy, you might say. Enter the Trotula, a set of medical texts written possibly by a woman in the 12th century focusing on women's health. It included advice on fertility, menstruation, and even appearance. One section suggested that women who wanted to look more attractive should pluck their eyebrows and bleach their hair with vinegar. Another helpfully advised that to conceive a son, a woman should lie on her right side after sex, because obviously. Scientists still argue whether the Trotula was widely used or just an elite reference, but its mere existence proves that people were asking the same questions we still ask today. How does the body work? How can we stay healthy? And why does it sometimes betray us when things get romantic? Now, let's move to the good stuff. Sex. Sex guides. Yes, they existed. No, they weren't exactly what you'd call sexy. The Secretum Secretorum. The secret of secrets supposedly written by Aristotle, but probably not included instructions for bedroom behavior, sexual positions, and even aphrodisiacs. The illustrations, let's just say, they make modern stick figures look like Renaissance masterpieces. One manuscript shows a couple in what appears to be a deeply uncomfortable embrace, surrounded by disapproving farm animals. Not exactly mood lighting. These manuals often mixed actual advice with colorful interpretations. For instance, some warned against sex during certain lunar phases, as it could result in children with undesirable traits like being overly hairy or oddly too argumentative. Others claimed that the first child conceived in a marriage would always resemble the mother's most recent sexual partner, which well made things tense. Fringe tidbit. A few texts recommended drinking potions made from crushed pearls, bull's gallbladder, or dried hedgehog to improve virility. One such remedy involved boiling ant eggs in wine. That's right, ant eggs in wine for stamina. Medieval love brought to you by desperation and poor chemistry. But not all these texts were anonymous scribbles passed in taverns. Some were commissioned by nobility. Wealthy households often had herbals books describing the medicinal and sometimes erotic properties of plants. Parsley, for instance, was believed to provoke menstruation and therefore considered an abortifacient. Sage was supposed to promote fertility. Fennel. Well, that just made your breath better, which honestly was probably a good idea. You might imagine a nervous young couple flipping through one of these books by candlelight trying to figure out which route to chew, which way to face, or whether it was safe to make love during a thunderstorm. Spoiler according to some texts, absolutely not. Lightning was considered bad for the soul and your potential offspring. And speaking of offspring, there was serious confusion about how babies were made. Some thought it was all about heat. Others claimed it was the man's seed and the woman's blood combining magically. The idea of the egg that didn't show up in Europe until long after it was theorized in other parts of the world. The ovary was essentially a myth for most of medieval history. One widespread belief that the female orgasm was necessary for conception. That's right. Early European texts insisted that a woman had to climax in order to draw in the man's seed. It's wildly incorrect, but points for effort. You recline now, picturing an anxious couple sitting at the edge of their creaky bed, surrounded by scrolls herbs and possibly a nervous goat. She's chewing licorice root because the book said it soothes the womb. He's adjusting his tunic and asking whether north-facing positions really make the baby taller. The mood is confused. The science is questionable, but the effort sincere. And beyond the bumbling texts and wild theories, there was still something deeply human in all of this. The desire to understand, to connect, to please and protect. Even if that meant swallowing powdered coral or drinking boiled owl eyes, yes, that was a thing. People wanted to do it right, even when they barely knew what right was. Some manuals included emotional advice too. They reminded men to be gentle, to not treat their wives like objects, to understand that lovemaking was a shared experience. These were rare, but they existed glimmers of empathy in a world of chalky potions and awkward diagrams. And you can't help but smile, because for all the mistakes, the misinformation, and the ant-egg wine, there's something tender about it. People were trying. They were fumbling their way toward each other with parchment and poetry, hoping that desire could be decoded with ink and sage. So as you lie back under the thatched roof of your mind, parchment curling in your hands, you exhale. You've learned that medieval science was a strange mix of the sacred and the absurd. But underneath it all, the same questions we still ask today. How do we love each other better? How do we protect ourselves? What makes a good night? Great. You don't need a potion for that. Just curiosity. And maybe a candle that doesn't set the bed sheets on fire. You're walking through a bustling medieval marketplace, dodging chickens and side eyes when something strange catches your attention. A man in a brightly colored tunic is reciting poetry to another man. They're laughing too close, too comfortable. No one seems shocked, just mildly amused. You blink. Isn't this supposed to be the Middle Ages? You know, rigid gender roles, fire and brimstone sermons, and marriages arranged by the cow load. Not quite, because tonight we're lifting the heavy velvet curtain on cross-dressing, gender-bending, and forbidden love in the medieval world. And it's a lot more surprising than you'd think. Let's start with this. The medieval period was not some unbroken line of repression. Sure, there were strict laws and a ton of judgment, but also space for exceptions, ambiguity, and unexpected defiance. You just had to know where to look. Scientific fact. Historical records show that people didn't always fit neatly into the male-female binary, even in times that emphasized it heavily. There are well-documented accounts of individuals who lived and dressed as the opposite sex, and in some cases were quietly accepted by their communities. It wasn't common, but it also wasn't always punished. Take the case of Eleanor Reichener, a 14th century Londoner, assigned male at birth, who dressed and lived as a woman and worked as an embroiderer and sex worker. She was arrested and questioned in 1395, not just for cross-dressing, but for having relations with both men and women. What's fascinating? The court records are detailed and complex, but she wasn't executed or even imprisoned long-term. Scholars still debate whether the authorities saw her as a criminal or simply as someone outside their comprehension. Scientists still argue whether Eleanor's treatment reflects an undercurrent of medieval tolerance or whether her relatively light punishment was a fluke. Either way, her story remains one of the most vivid examples of gender variance in a world often assumed to be monochrome. But it wasn't only individuals like Eleanor who played with the rules. Cross-dressing appears frequently in medieval literature, and not always as a joke. In courtly romances and folk tales, women disguised as men to escape danger seek freedom or pursue love. Some stories even end with the heroine choosing to remain in male clothing, earning respect, land, and titles. One famous example, the ballads of Sylvia and Wide, where Ide, dressed as a man to escape persecution, ends up accidentally marrying a princess who, by the way, falls in love with her without knowing her true identity. Eventually, a miraculous, angelic intervention resolves things because plot. But the subtext, love, even queer love, had its place, even if it had to sneak in the back door of the canon, fringe tidbit. In some medieval passion, plays, and religious festivals, actors played roles of the opposite sex as part of tradition. Male monks, for instance, sometimes played the Virgin Mary in church dramas. Was it subversive? Not always. But did it blur the lines? You bet. And once the lines blur, people start to see the world a little differently. Now, let's wander into same-sex desire, which is where things get complicated. The official church line. Very much nope. Same-sex acts were considered sins with punishments ranging from public penance to, in some cases, execution. But and here's the twist. Those harsh punishments were rarely applied consistently. For much of the medieval period, especially before the 13th century, enforcement was surprisingly lax, and local attitudes often varied wildly. Monasteries, in particular, were hotbeds, pun intended, of emotional intimacy. Letters between monks sometimes contain language that to the modern reader sounds overtly romantic, even erotic. I long for your embrace, one might write. Your absence burns me like fire. Were these just poetic flourishes in a time of flowery writing? Maybe. But some historians believe they reflect real complex relationships that blurred the line between platonic and passionate. Likewise, in female convents, close bonds between nuns were often encouraged, called particular friendships. These relationships could be deeply affectionate, physically, demonstrative, and in some cases, possibly sexual. The church didn't fully understand them, and often they didn't want to. If it looked like piety and kept the nuns quiet, it was easier not to ask too many questions. You sit with that for a moment. Behind closed doors in candlelit cells and cloisters, people found ways to connect, even when the outside world said they shouldn't. Let's head back to the village square now. You see two young men walking together, laughing, leaning into one another, like the world is just background noise. Maybe they're just friends, or maybe not. Maybe there's a barn they sneak away to at night. Maybe they've worked out a silent code, a system of glances that means meet me at the well after dark. Desire in the Middle Ages didn't always follow rules. Sometimes it tiptoed, sometimes it ran full speed and leapt over fences, and sometimes it hid in plain sight behind the safety of friendship duty or shared prayer. And yes, there were real dangers. Accusations of sodomy or unnatural behavior could lead to trials, exile, or worse. But there was also space, tiny, flickering hidden spaces where people loved each other despite it all. Even in popular art and literature, you find hints. Gender-swapped saints, longing glances in tapestries, villains who seem a little too obsessed with their beautiful rivals. It's there if you look. You might be thinking, was this love, or just the constraints of a society that separated men and women so much that same-sex closeness was inevitable? Historians still debate that too, but the result is the same intimacy thrived in unexpected places. People found each other in corners the rules forgot to police. Now, imagine this. A traveling performer arrives at a village fair. She wears a tunic, her hair tucked under a cap, her voice low. She performs tricks, tells jokes, drinks with the men. One night, a local girl catches her in a quiet moment, sees past the disguise, and doesn't run, doesn't tell. Just reaches out and says, "I won't say a word." That's how it happened. In tiny moments of courage, in stolen nights, in bold disguises and quiet trust. So you lie back. Now the blanket pulled to your chin, your thoughts drifting between memory and imagination. The world might have insisted on strict roles, but the heart rarely listens. And in every century, there are always people brave enough to love as they are, even if they have to wear someone else's clothes to do it. Because underneath the tunic, the armor, the habit, or the homespun dress, everyone was just trying to find someone to walk with. Someone who looked back at them and said, "Yes, you." The wind rattles the shutters as you shuffle into the apothecary's cramped little shop. It smells like dried lavender, moldy parchment, and something vaguely sulfuric. Shelves creak under the weight of jars filled with pickled roots, shriveled frogs, and powders labeled in Latin that you definitely can't read. You're here for something delicate, discreet, maybe even a little illegal. Because tonight, we're talking about contraception, abortion, and fertility treatments. Or, as medieval people might have called it, women's secrets. You don't need to be a time traveler to guess that medieval reproductive medicine was more guesswork than gynecology. But here's the twist. Despite the lack of microscopes or menstrual tracking apps, people were thinking about fertility. They were experimenting, debating, documenting, and yes, trying to avoid pregnancy or encourage it depending on the situation. Let's start with the basic reality. Sex in the Middle Ages often led to children. A lot of them. Many families had 6, 8, 10 kids, though not all survived. But having more children than you could afford, or bearing one out of wedlock, could spell disaster. So naturally, people tried to find ways around it. Enter folk contraception. Scientific fact. Historical records show the use of various herbal contraceptives across Europe. One of the most commonly mentioned was pennyroyal, a minty herb believed to prevent conception or induce menstruation. Women might drink it as a tea chewet or even insert soaked cloths vaginally. Other herbs used similarly included rue wild carrot, aka Queen Anne's lace, and tansy. Were these effective sometimes? But they were also risky. The line between medicinal and poisonous was razor thin, and dosages weren't exactly precise. You might stop a pregnancy or your heart. Fringe tidbit. Some texts recommended applying mixtures of salt, honey, and crocodile dung as a pessary to block conception. That was actually borrowed from ancient Egyptian practices. No crocodiles in England. But hey, the imagination was international. But let's back up. Before you even get to contraceptives, you have the issue of fertility itself. Infertility, whether real or suspected, was a major concern, especially among nobles, where producing heirs was a full-time job. If a couple failed to conceive, the blame usually fell on the woman. Her womb was cold, closed, or misaligned. One of the more peculiar beliefs that the womb could be tilted the wrong way, and you could fix this by lying in certain positions after sex, or in more extreme cases, by having someone physically shake or massage the abdomen to reposition it. Gentle? Not usually. Scientists still argue whether these treatments were purely symbolic or occasionally had practical value. Some pelvic manipulation techniques may have alleviated certain conditions, but more often, it was just someone poking you with old ideas. And if none of it worked, there were potions, powders, amulets. You could wear a carved moonstone around your neck, or sleep with a fertility charm under your pillow. Some women even sought out saints' relics, praying for intervention. There are letters written to nuns and monks begging for prayers to open the womb or bless the marriage bed. Faith and fertility were deeply intertwined. Now, let's get into the murkier stuff, abortifacients. These were herbs and methods used not to prevent pregnancy, but to end one. While technically illegal under church doctrine, the reality was nuanced. Before the 13th century, quickening the moment, a woman first felt fetal movement, usually around 16 to 20 weeks, was considered the point at which a fetus gained a soul. Anything done before that ethically murky, yes, but sometimes tolerated, sometimes ignored. Midwives often held this secret knowledge. They were the ones who brewed the potions, whispered the remedies, and quietly helped women manage their reproductive lives. And for this, they were both revered and feared. A midwife was your savior until something went wrong. Then she was a witch. Imagine a small cottage at twilight. A woman, pale and trembling, sits with her skirts lifted slightly. An older woman grinds herbs with a worn mortar, muttering under her breath. It's not magic. It's medicine. It's also illegal. But it's been done this way for generations. Let's not forget the other side of this equation, men. While most responsibility and blame fell on women, men were also prescribed remedies for impotence or infertility. These included drinking wine boiled with rooster testicles. Yes, really, wearing certain stones against the skin, or even sleeping with a fertility charm under the tongue. No comment on the taste. And yet, for all this, people kept making babies. The human reproductive system is persistent like that. But sometimes, pregnancy wasn't the problem, desire was. For people who wanted sex without the consequences, options were few and fraught. Some couples abstained during fertile windows, though they didn't really know when those were, or resorted to rudimentary forms of withdrawal. which, as you might guess, was not endorsed by the church. In fact, any attempt to separate sex from reproduction was considered sinful, pleasure for its own sake, suspicious, contraceptives heretical. Even talking openly about these things was risky, and yet the records are full of whispered mentions, secret treatments, and quiet resistance. And for those who defied the rules, there were consequences. One court case tells of a woman accused of selling a potion that prevents the seed from planting. She was fined, shamed, and told to repent. Another story recounts a nun who helped a fellow sister lose her unwanted burden. The punishment, silent penance and exile from the convent. But just as often, people turned a blind eye. If a noble family needed to avoid scandal, the problem quietly disappeared. If a peasant woman couldn't feed another child, the village might choose not to notice what she brewed behind her cottage. You pause picturing a young woman hiding a pouch of dried herbs in her bodice, her fingers shaking her heart louder than the church bells. She doesn't want to be a mother, not now, not like this. And maybe someone helps her. Or maybe she does it alone, hoping, praying, aching. The medieval world didn't have Planned Parenthood, but it had whispers, networks of midwives, hushed conversations over washing buckets, codes passed between sisters and aunts and friends who knew the price of a secret. And in all of this, one truth holds control over reproduction has always been power. Who has it, who takes it, who loses it, and who risks everything to reclaim it. You lie back, the imagined scent of rue and pennyroyal thick in the air. Someone somewhere is stirring a pot over a low fire. Someone is calculating days in her head. Someone is lying awake wondering if it worked, if she'll be spared, or if the world is about to shift beneath her feet. And someone else. She's smiling in the dark, the potion tucked safely away, knowing that tonight she gets to choose. The room is quiet, except for the soft creak of a wooden chair and the occasional cough from the hallway. You're sitting with a quill in your hand, squinting at parchment that smells faintly of mildew and disappointment. You've been asked to confess your sins. You're 16, and you're pretty sure what happened last night counts. Because here, in the flickering candlelight of a stone-walled chamber, you face a ritual as old as medieval guilt itself, the confessional. And nothing complicated sex in the Middle Ages quite like the constant tug of war between desire and repentance. Tonight, we descend into the shadowy psychology of the Christian conscience, where sin wasn't just an act, it was a state of being. And for centuries, sex sat at the top of that slippery slope to spiritual ruin. Let's start with how often people thought about sin. Hint: a lot. The medieval church was obsessed with cataloging moral failure, not just the obvious stuff, like murder or heresy, but everything. Especially sexual thoughts, fantasies, actions, dreams, impulses, and occasional awkward accidents in the bathhouse. Nothing was off limits. If it came from your loins, it probably came with a side of eternal damnation. Scientific fact: the 7th through 12th centuries saw the rise of penitentials' detailed manuals used by priests to assign penance for sins. These books were essentially medieval spiritual calculators. Did you have sex on a feast day? That's 10 days of fasting. Did you have sex standing up? 20 days, and no meat. Did you have impure thoughts about a goat? Better clear your schedule. These penitentials were oddly specific. Some went into incredible detail about various sexual acts, not because priests were curious, though one does wonder, but because they needed to assign just the right spiritual consequence. The result: a culture of spiritual micromanagement that seeped into every pillow, every alleyway, every haystack rendezvous. You couldn't just sin, you had to account for it. And the people they confessed, constantly. In big cities and tiny villages, people lined up at confessionals to whisper their shame into the ears of tired, often underpaid priests. Not because they were all deeply pious, but because the church controlled everything marriage, inheritance, burial. If you wanted to die without rotting in purgatory for a few centuries, you'd better confess before the bell tolled. And here's where things get messy. Because the line between sin and normal human behavior was often razor thin, the church taught that any sex outside of marriage was sinful. But even within marriage, there were still rules. No sex on holy days. No sex during menstruation. No sex just for pleasure. And if you enjoyed it a little too much, that could be sin adjacent, depending on which bishop was in charge. Scientists still argue whether the church's obsession with sexual purity reflected real societal behavior, or whether people mostly nodded along and kept doing what they wanted behind closed doors. Either way, the guilt stuck. Medieval sermons are full of fiery warnings. Desire is the gateway to hell. Lust is a fire that consumes the soul. Even loving your spouse too much could distract you from loving God. So, how did people cope? With incredible creativity and some well-placed loopholes. For instance, you could confess before you sinned, not just after, like a spiritual prepayment plan. And while confessing the same sin multiple times was discouraged, many people did it anyway. Some historians even suggest that confession became a kind of emotional release valve, a way to feel heard even if forgiveness felt abstract. Fringe tidbit. Some medieval mystics wrote about erotic visions of Christ. Yes, you heard that right. Female mystics like Saint Catherine of Siena and Saint Teresa of Avila describe deeply sensual, intimate encounters with Jesus. They weren't considered sinful because the love was divine, but the language, oh, it was steamy. Think Bride of Christ meets metaphorical honeymoon suite. You settle into the mental image of a weary priest listening to confession after confession, trying not to yawn as another farmer admits to breaking the Wednesday fast again. Then comes the serious voice. The confession is whispered. It involves a neighbor, a stable, possibly a dream. And the priest sighs not in judgment, but in recognition. Because if there's one thing medieval clergy knew, it's that people don't stop wanting just because the rules say so. So the church doubled down. Guilt was baked into sermon songs and even architecture. Gargoyles leered from cathedral corners, reminding passers-by that sin was always watching. Moralizing images in manuscripts showed men and women being dragged to hell for the tiniest indiscretions, often involving some surprisingly detailed illustrations of naked bottoms. And yet, people still lived. They laughed, flirted, touched each other in the dark, and they confessed. Then they did it again. One real story tells of a peasant woman who confessed to having sex with her husband during Lent, then again the following week, because she forgot it was also a saint's feast day. Her penance, bread and water for 10 days and walking barefoot to the church. By the third week, she just stayed in confession on rotation. Some call it devotion. Others might call it a scheduling issue. Now shift your focus to a different kind of confessional. Two lovers caught by circumstance confessing their feelings under the cover of darkness. A note passed by candlelight. A touch at the edge of the field. These were sins too, at least on paper. But in practice, they were just people fumbling toward connection in a world stacked with spiritual tripwires. And sometimes people stopped confessing altogether. They ran off to the woods. They married in secret. They found a priest who looked the other way. The farther you got from the cathedral, the more flexible the rules became. Still, the fear lingered. Of damnation, of discovery, of disappointing a God who seemed to have very strong opinions about bed sheets. You lie back now, the stone floor cool beneath your imagined spine, the candle low. Maybe you've sinned today, maybe not. Either way, someone's already built a system to measure it. But beyond the rules and rituals, the guilt and grimacing the truth remains, confession wasn't just about sin. It was about story, about being heard, about saying, this is what I did, this is who I am, help me make sense of it. Because medieval sex, as tangled as it was in religion, politics, and punishment, was still deeply, inescapably human. And no matter how heavy the penance, people still reached out in the dark, hoping not just for forgiveness, but for someone to reach back. The wooden stage creaks under your feet, the velvet curtain swaying slightly in the breeze from an open door. Someone's playing a lute off-key in the corner, and the tavern smells like spilled ale roast onions and a hint of mischief. The room is buzzing not with war news or politics, but with laughter winks and bawdy rhymes shouted from the shadows. Because if the church tried to keep sex sacred and silent, the medieval stage made it loud, crude, and wildly entertaining. Tonight, we're tumbling headfirst into the surprisingly cheeky world of medieval entertainment and humor about sex, where the jokes are low, the morals are loose, and the audience is very much in on the act. Let's start with a fun fact. Medieval people had senses of humor. Yes, even in plague years, especially in plague years. In a world where death lurked behind every bush and toothache, laughter wasn't just fun, it was survival. And few things tickled the medieval funny bone more reliably than sex, especially when it was inappropriate, clumsy, or outright scandalous. Scientific fact humor is closely linked to the prefrontal cortex, which processes both complex language and social nuance. Even in the 14th century, people understood the fine art of innuendo. The difference, their filters were often less refined. So, what kind of sexual humor are we talking about? Think Saturday Night Live meets Monty Python, but with a lot more flatulence and absolutely zero HR department. In popular fabliaux, short comic tales from France, England, and Italy, sex was the punchline, the plot twist, and sometimes the entire plot. These stories featured cheating wives, bumbling monks, overly amorous priests, horny peasants, and disguises that led to bedroom mix-ups worthy of a soap opera. The morals were flexible. The punchlines usually dirty. One famous fabliau tells of a wife who hides her lover in a flour barrel when her husband returns unexpectedly. The husband, suspicious, demands she lift her skirt to prove she hasn't been up to anything. And as she does, the lover peeks out of the barrel and joins the inspection. The husband never notices. The crowd roars. Fringe tidbit. There are entire manuscripts from the 13th and 14th centuries filled with illuminated marginalia. Little illustrations scrawled in the edges of religious texts that feature naked figures, animals doing unspeakable things, and monks engaged in distinctly unmonkish activities. Scholars are still scratching their heads. Some think they were jokes by bored scribes. Others think they were subtle protest art. Either way, they prove that medieval humor often had zero chill. And then there were the mystery plays, religious dramas performed in public squares meant to teach Christian morality. But even these holy productions often included comic relief in the form of lusty devils bumbling sinners or misbehaving biblical figures. Audiences loved it. A man playing a devil might chase a woman through the crowd with a sausage. Yes, a sausage. It's a living. Scientists still argue whether this kind of humor was cathartic release or quiet rebellion. Were people laughing with the church or at it? The answer, as usual, is both. Humor gave space for taboo topics, especially sex, to be explored, ridiculed, and in a way understood. Let's turn the page to pilgrimage culture, where bawdy songs flourished. Pilgrims might travel hundreds of miles for spiritual growth, but they brought their sense of humor with them. Many songs were about bodily functions, lusty innkeepers, and what happened when a monk and a miller walked into a nunnery. Pilgrimage. Come for the relic stay, for the roadside tavern comedy. The most famous medieval writer to blend sex and satire, Geoffrey Chaucer. In the Canterbury Tales, he gave us characters like the wife of Bath, a bold, unapologetically sexual woman who tells tales of multiple husbands, strategic bedroom negotiations, and what women really want: spoiler power. Her prologue is part autobiography, part feminist manifesto, part stand-up routine, and she owns every word. Then there's The Miller's Tale, in which a young man woos a carpenter's wife and tricks the husband into sleeping in a bathtub to prepare for Noah's second flood. At one point, another suitor is tricked into kissing the woman's bare bottom through a window. When he returns for a second try, he gets a hot poker in the face. It's slapstick. It's racy. It's shockingly modern. Imagine the scene: a crowded tavern, peasants and nobles alike, gathered around a fire, passing mugs of ale, laughing until they wheeze. The stories might be crude, but the connection real. A reminder that laughter, even laughter about sex, is a kind of human glue. Even the carols weren't safe. Some popular folk songs were delightfully misleading, starting with innocent verses about birds or baking, and ending with not-so-subtle metaphors for, let's say, warming the oven. These double entendres were often sung at feasts, festivals, and weddings where everyone laughed, even the priests. And speaking of weddings, they were the most humor-laced events of all. In many regions, it was traditional for guests to escort the couple to bed and make a public spectacle of the wedding night's conclusion. Jokes were made, songs were sung. Sometimes shoes were thrown at the door for luck, or maybe encouragement. A local comic might even perform a skit about the bride's future skills, or lack thereof. You imagine a feast hall now, heavy with wine fumes and wood smoke. A storyteller launches into a tale of a lovesick knight who mistakes a goose for his paramour in the dark. The crowd erupts. The priest chuckles into his goblet. The lady of the manor fans herself and pretends not to be amused. Because in the Middle Ages, sex wasn't just whispered about in corners. It was laughed at, performed, and played with. Not always kindly, not always fairly, but very, very often. Was this humor empowering? Sometimes. Mockery could reinforce stereotypes: lusty women, dim-witted husbands, deceitful lovers. But it also poked holes in the facade of perfection. It reminded people that everyone, priests, peasants, nobles, was a little messy, a little ridiculous, and very much made of flesh. So, as you snuggle under your metaphorical blanket, you exhale a quiet chuckle. Somewhere, centuries ago, someone else did too. They laughed at the same kind of jokes. They rolled their eyes at a suggestive rhyme. They leaned close to someone they liked and whispered, "That one's about us, isn't it?" Because in the end, sex was never just about the act. It was about the connection, the courage to be seen, the joy of being ridiculous together. And in a world where everything felt so serious, plague, war, damnation laughter might have been the most rebellious thing of all. It's late now. The fire has died down to embers, and the village is quiet. Even the owls have stopped calling. You're lying beneath a rough wool blanket, listening to the slow creaks of an old roof adjusting in the breeze, and the silence feels thicker than the night. You've walked through the castles and kitchens, feast halls, and forests. You've peeked into the bedrooms, confessional booths, bathhouses, and back alleys. And now, you arrive at the edge of the story where sex in the Middle Ages meets its many endings. But before the candle burns out completely, let's pause and look back at the world we've wandered through. Sex in the medieval world was never just about two people under a blanket. It was about control by the church, by men, by social customs so tightly wound that even sneezing too provocatively might earn a whisper. But it was also about resistance. Quiet fumbling, brave resistance. People who bent the rules. People who broke them. People who found moments of real connection in a world that so often insisted they didn't deserve it. And perhaps the strangest twist of all, sometimes the most lasting love stories were the least expected. Take the 15th century letters between Marjorie Paston and her husband John, part of the now famous Paston Letters. Marjorie's father disapproved of John. The match was socially inconvenient, but they married anyway. And when they were apart because of war business or long winters, Marjorie wrote him letters so full of yearning gentleness and deep marital fondness that they feel modern even now. She called him my own sweetheart, a term that warms across 6 centuries. No scandal, no disguises, just a woman missing her husband. Proof that not all medieval love was tragic or twisted. Some of it was just ordinary, honest, and that might be the most beautiful kind. Scientific fact: oxytocin and vasopressin, 2 key neuropeptides linked to bonding, affect long-term pair bonding in humans. That's right, love, even in the era of lice and leeches, had a biological foundation. Medieval people didn't have the terms for it, but they felt it just the same. Still, the reality was harsh. Love could be dangerous. Sex could mean pregnancy scandal or sin. Queer people women the poor, many lived with the constant risk of being caught in someone else's moral spotlight. And while we've chuckled our way through medieval jokes and flirtations, we can't forget that a wrong touch, the wrong rumor, could ruin a life. And yet people still dared. They dared to kiss in candlelight, to write poetry in secret, to give in to forbidden urges, and sometimes to pay the price. But they did it anyway. And if there's one thread that runs through every castle and cottage we visited, it's this: humans have always tried to be close, to know and be known. Whether wrapped in velvet or wool, protected by a chastity belt, or hiding in a barn, the desire was the same. Scientists still argue whether we can ever really understand how medieval people felt emotionally, spiritually, physically about sex. Much of what survives are the extreme scandals, rules, sermons, and satire. But in between those lines, in the spaces between pages, the silences of records, there is something more human and more hopeful. Because for every fire and brimstone warning, there was a stolen kiss. For every court case, a whispered joke. For every punishment, a promise. You think back to the girl who plucked herbs in secret, the boy who blushed in a monastery, the wife who laughed too loud at a sausage joke, the knight who carried a token sewn into his sleeve, knowing full well he might never come home. None of them knew they'd end up in a sleep story. But all of them lived awkwardly, bravely, and sometimes even joyfully, in a world that tried so hard to define them only by what they were allowed to want. But you've seen through that now. Sex in the Middle Ages wasn't wild the way you might have imagined. Not all the time. Not most of the time. It was messy, tender, regretful, rebellious, and above all, real. Real people. Real feelings. Real attempts at figuring it out without modern plumbing or reliable calendars. And sure, they had rules about what day you could do it and in what direction, and whether a thunderstorm would cause your baby to grow extra toes. But they also had hope and humor, and something underneath all the fear, a desire to connect, just like us. So, you roll over out, the mental weight of 20 generations settling lightly on your shoulders. You've laughed. You've cringed. You've maybe raised an eyebrow at a few turnip-based metaphors. And now, you rest. The fire is out. The stories are spent. And the last page curls inward as the air settles into stillness. You lie there, eyes closed now, blanket drawn up to your chin, and feel the quiet weight of time pressing gently around you. 1,000 years of whispered longing, forbidden glances, clumsy kisses behind haystacks. It all slips into silence. You think of candlelight on a stone wall, the creak of a wooden bed, laughter trailing off in a tavern corner, a love letter folded carefully beneath a cloak. You think of people, imperfect, uncertain, brave in their own small ways, fumbling through a world that wanted them to behave, to obey, to never ask for more than what was assigned. And yet they asked, they reached, they touched, they hoped. And now, in this soft moment, you're part of that story too. No rules, no lectures, just the quiet comfort of knowing that you're not the first person to wonder, to wander, to want. And you won't be the last. Let the images fade Now stone towers, muddy roads, awkward courtships, giggles behind curtains. Let it all drift out with the last of the candle smoke. You're safe, you're warm, and the past is asleep beside you, dreaming of its own quiet little rebellions. End of script. Sweet dreams.